Today's episode, we are spending time with Gail Simmons, judge and producer of Bravo's Emmy-winning series Top Chef. Gail walks us through her journey from food journalism to author to Top Chef producer, as well as her journey and romance with food since she was a child. We hope you enjoy. I kind of want to just dive in. It's like you have such an interesting background. So within this podcast, our audience really loves to hear about how people have come to who they are, and I know one of your mantras has always been, not really having a preconceived notion of who you wanted to be. But I'd love to kind of start off with, how you got into food and what food has meant in your life, and then kind of talk about your evolution.
Sure. Big topic.
I
don't know if we can get it all into the podcast, but we'll try. I'll try not to. I sometimes tend to get a little too deep, so I'll try to keep the overview.
Oh, good. We love it.
Food is a big topic. I mean, I never set out to do what I do right now, and you're absolutely right in that I strongly disagree with the notion of like having a 5-year plan sort of thing. I'm not saying you shouldn't have goals and ambition, and I think I have both, but I really think that when you have really set goals, you miss opportunities. And I think that's how I got to where I was, because I never decided I had to just be this one thing and that there was only one way to get there. And that I wanted to create for myself a career that I loved, doing things that I thought I was pretty good at or that I was really interested in, and just really tried and still try, because I am still evolving, to take on work, say yes to things that are often a departure from what I did yesterday, and never get to set in a goal so that I lose sight of sort of what I could be or what I could kind of try. And that doesn't always mean being successful at it, but it certainly means that I've been able to do a lot of really fun things that I never imagined I'd get to do. Food became my thing quite sort of by greater design, but not because I necessarily set out to work in it. I came by it honestly. My mother, I grew up in Canada, in Toronto, right in sort of central Toronto, right in the downtown core. And my mother was ahead of her time in a lot of ways. She was a food writer and a cooking teacher in the early years of my life, not my whole childhood. For the probably first 10 years that I was around, my mother wrote a column in the Globe and Mail, which is Canada's biggest newspaper, and she taught cooking out of our home. It started because she was a great spontaneous cook, no formal training, but her mother was a great cook, and she was around a lot of great cooks and spent time learning to cook and teach herself. She was, an avid traveler, and so was my father. And she just started teaching her friends, the other moms in the neighborhood in the 70s and 80s, how to cook at a time that it was sort of antithetical to do so. It was a time when women were trying to get into the workforce, right? It was like that big 70s women's rights movement of
I don't want TV dinners.
Yeah, a lot of TV dinners and microwaves, and how do I stop cooking so that I can have a job and provide for my family and have a self-fulfilling career outside of the house. And my mother sort of embraced that. My mother always worked. My mother's had actually a lot of really interesting jobs and careers in her life, sort of in 4 different waves. She studied political science. She has a master's in international politics. She then went on to work in public relations in the music industry. Then she became a food writer and cooking teacher. And then for the majority of my life, from the age of about 10 onwards until she retired in her late 60s, she managed classical musicians. So she did a lot of different things, but always in the arts, really. She was the publicist for the Toronto Symphony Orchestra before I was born. And then she did this whole food thing for probably 15 years. and then managed classical musicians, some of the greatest classical musicians like in the world for years, like in their Canadian tours and as their manager. So all that said, the food part was in the most formative of years for me. And I grew up with a lot of people in my house. They renovated my house. My parents renovated our kitchen in the early 80s so that it was a very set up as a teaching kitchen. There were always people in my house. My mother and father were always throwing dinner parties. My mother was always cooking, and my mother was always teaching. When the cooking school got too big, it moved to the local middle school, to the home ec rooms, and she taught cooking out of the home ec rooms of my middle school in the evenings. So food was always a big part of our life. We also traveled a lot. As I said, my parents were great travelers and food lovers. My father was from South Africa. His entire family was there until my grandparents died and the rest of the family immigrated to Australia. So we've never had family in Canada, in Toronto. My mother's family was always in Montreal and California. So we traveled a lot. I spent sort of every other year of the first 20 years of my life traveling to South Africa and other parts of kind of sub-Saharan Africa to see my family and explore that part of the world. And that was at a time when there weren't really direct flights, so we stopped in North Africa, we stopped in England, you know, all these places. And so my parents taught us to have to be resourceful about what we ate from an early age, and also to appreciate the food of other cultures, which also I think inevitably leads to have an appreciation for other cultures in the world. And so that was the context of my childhood. I never thought I would work in food. I never necessarily gave it much thought. It was what my mother did, but in a way, it didn't occur to me to be a job because I grew up and then went on to college and went to a very academic school. I went to McGill University, and all of my girlfriends were doing very traditionally sort of straightforward things out of college. I have a brilliant group of female friends, and a big group of them at the time. They've all gone on to do very different things, but went to law school, did an MBA, went to medical school, you know, or did master's degrees in psychology or whatever they did. And every single one of them has an interesting career. But not, you know, I think 3 of them really went into artistic pursuits, let's say 3 or 4 of them. But at the time when we were graduating college and they all knew exactly what they wanted to do, I had no clue what I wanted to do at all. And that really worried me, and it worried my mom even more. And I moved home from university into their basement and was sort of depressed and disillusioned that I went to this great school, worked hard, got good marks, and it did not prepare me at all for a real job. As sort of Bachelor of Arts degrees at liberal arts colleges do. It got me to think analytically. It taught me how to write a great essay, and I'd read a million books, and I'd learned about the ancient civilizations of the world. I had learned a third language actually, because I had gone to French immersion.
You majored in anthropology, right?
I did, yeah, and Spanish. Okay. I did a program that doesn't exist at McGill anymore called Humanistic Studies that required a focus and a secondary focus. So I did anthropology and Spanish language and literature. I went to Spain, lived in Spain for a year, a semester of college. So I came back with all of these skills, but they were not practical skills to get me a job. That said, what I had also done at college was learn to cook for myself and written for my school paper because I loved to write. And I also loved to eat and cook. So I ended up having written a lot of restaurant reviews for my student paper. Again, never under the auspices of then making that a career, ever.
Yeah.
But when I graduated and went back home and had no idea what I was going to do, my mom set me up for a coffee with the daughter of a very close friend. And when we sat down, she was really cool. She was a television producer by coincidence, and asked me what I wanted to do with what I liked to do, not what's a career, she didn't ask me for jobs. She was just like, write down on this napkin what you like to do. Like, what are you interested in? What brings you joy, sort of. And I wrote down eat, write, travel, and cook. And she was like, all right, so what's the problem? Like, what's everyone so worried about? Go do it. And that was really like gave me the freedom and the relief that I actually did have interest and I could figure something out. And then that was allowed.
Yeah.
It was like she gave me permission to follow my dreams and not necessarily what I thought I was supposed to be doing, which was what was getting me so stuck in the first place. And once I had that permission from her, who was like, she was probably in her late 20s at the time, um, it set me on a totally different path. And I got an internship at a magazine because I loved writing and thought I wanted to be a journalist. Okay, I can write. I love writing about food and travel and things like that. I got an internship at a magazine and then at a big national newspaper in Canada as an editorial assistant. And I found my place. And at both places, I realized that I was really drawn to the food sections of those things: restaurant reviews, ingredients, learning about the food cultures of the city I lived in, and then about Canada and about cookbooks. And so when it occurred to me that that was my beat, that was what I wanted to do in earnest, that was what I wanted to write about, I realized I didn't know anything about cooking. I thought I did, but I was 22 and I had like cooked for myself and my roommates and thrown some dinner parties at my parents' house. And so if I wanted to really write about food in earnest, I needed to learn how to cook and I needed to kind of speak the language of the kitchen. So I quit those jobs and I moved to New York, went to culinary school, and I never came home. And that's how it all started.
That's amazing. How scared were you? How scared were you when you were on the plane?
It's funny. I wasn't scared because, again, this was not a long-term plan. I didn't
Yeah.
go to culinary school to be a chef. I knew I wanted to write. I wanted to be in food media, but what food media was at that time was magazines and publishing and newspapers and writing. I wanted to be a food writer. And it was only then that I realized, oh, that's funny. That's what my mom did. And only then did I have this sort of like crisis of conscience that I can't believe that fate forced me into doing exactly what my mother did, even though I never wanted to just be my mother, right? And that's, I just think that was something that as a young adult I struggled with, but now I embrace wholeheartedly because I realized how amazing she was and how trailblazing she was. But the plane ride and kind of moving to New York, first of all, it was only an hour away. It's very close to Toronto. So it wasn't like even though I was leaving the country, it all felt very temporary. I was moving into one of my buddy's apartments, renting it out. I gave myself 8 months. I thought I'd go to culinary school. Then I'd go back to Toronto and I would be a big fish in a small pond and I could become a food writer. I never planned on staying in New York. My boyfriend at the time was still in Toronto. Ironically, he's also in New York now, but he's no longer my boyfriend, obviously. But I really planned on taking this knowledge that I was going to learn in the big city in New York, get this like big New York training, and take it back to Canada, where I would have my pick of jobs and I would be a star food writer. That was what I thought. So going to New York to pursue this did not feel like a crazy thing. I was like, I'm going to do it for a year. I'm going to do my stint in New York and get that experience and take it back to Toronto and be able to say I went to culinary school in New York and now I'm like the shit, Turns out I wasn't the shit.
And you ended up staying.
But I never left and was a small fish in a very big pond for a very long time.
Yeah. And now you, after that, took some jobs as like on lines and
I worked in kitchens, right? Part of finishing my culinary degree entailed doing an apprenticeship. And when I started culinary school, I assumed, that apprenticeship is going to go be in the test kitchen of a magazine, right? That was my job. That's what I wanted to do. I was going to go be, an assistant at Gourmet or Food and Wine Magazine or Bon Appetit for a couple months, get that experience and get it on my resume and then go back to Canada with it. But when I started thinking about that apprenticeship and I went to my culinary school and said, this is what I want to do because I want to be a food writer, they discouraged it. They said, that's not what you should do at all. If you really want to be a food writer, you actually still don't know that much about cooking. And going to a test kitchen can be fine, but if you really want to learn the language of the kitchen, you got to go to a professional kitchen first. You have, just because you've gone to culinary school now and done everything once, doesn't mean you know how to cook. and certainly doesn't make you a professional cook. Go earn your dues. Go learn what it's like to actually be a cook, and then go back to Canada, or then go to the magazine world and
Yeah.
take that experience with you. And they promised me that I would have more luck and more credibility if I spent some time in the kitchen first. So that's why I went into kitchens pretty reluctantly, actually, and with good reason. Cooking in the like late '90s in New York City kitchens was really hard, and I also was sort of ambitious, and I chose pretty tough kitchens where I was the only woman in both of the kitchens I cooked in. I was the only woman. There were women in the pastry kitchen of one of them, but that was it. I was the only cook that was a female cook on the line, and I wasn't necessarily treated well in all places, but I learned a ton, and I cried a lot, and I fought my way through it, and I ended up working in kitchens longer than just that sort of 6 week, 8 week stint that I was required, because I did realize that I was learning a lot. And in the second kitchen I worked in, I stayed because I actually really loved the energy of that kitchen. And so I ended up staying for a long, and also because I didn't know what the hell I was going to do next, right? I didn't know what that new job was going to be. And so I cooked for a while. I ended up leaving actually because one of my brothers was quite ill at the time, and I was worried and wanted to take time off to go home. But right before I went home to see him, I went back. I had been reading a lot of cookbooks and food books in my spare time. You know, the hours of a young line cook are not easy. They're sort of like 12, 14-hour days, but they're not at the time when anyone else is working. You're working evenings, weekends, and holidays. So when all my friends in New York were off, I was working. And when I was working, they were off playing. So at night, when I'd come home at midnight from a long day, when all the other cooks were going out drinking, I came home and I read a lot because I knew that was my goal, was to write. And I read a book by Jeffrey Steingarten, who was the food critic at Vogue at the time.
Yeah.
I read his first book, The Man Who Ate Everything, and it sort of just changed the game for me. And I took that book back to my culinary school to have, to that career services person who told me to go to kitchens in the first place, and said, I need to find out about this guy. Not that I wanted to be him, but in the book, he talked a lot about his assistants. They were all women, and they seemed to have the perfect job that I wanted, the perfect next step. They were cooking, they were recipe testing, they were doing research at the library, they were running around New York City to get ingredients, they were traveling to exotic locations to explore food culture. And that was what I wanted to do. And he was the only person who I knew who had really done it. Like, it wasn't like I just wanted to be a food critic. I wanted to immerse myself in the world of food. And he also happened to be the most extraordinary writer about food that I'd ever read. So I went back to culinary school and I told them, like, do you know this book? Because I'd never read Vogue magazine. I didn't know what a big deal he was. I brought the book and I was like, this guy, I need a job like one of his assistants. And the people at my culinary school said, oh, that's funny. He's looking for his new assistant and you should go interview with him. And I did. And I somehow got the job. And that was really why I left kitchens. I went home for a couple months. I needed to get a visa because I needed to be able to work for him. Came back. I went home kind of at Christmas of 1999, and came back with a visa to work for him for 2 years. And that's then what set me, what set me up to actually earnestly work in the world of food media. Yeah.
That's incredible. In terms of, when you're looking at food media and how much it's transformed over the last 25 years, 25 years, it's crazy.
It is crazy.
How have you seen, from when you started to obviously where you are now, what do you think has changed within culture as an anthropologist?
Sure. I mean, all of it. People don't even think about, like, when I was starting out, as I said, food media meant publishing.
Yeah.
meant books, magazines, newspapers, and even that was
100%.
very limited. It meant the back 3 pages of women's magazines. It meant one section in a newspaper, the dining or food
Yeah.
section of a newspaper. And it meant a select number of glossy magazines, Gourmet, Bon Appetit, Food and Wine, Savor, Cooks Illustrated.
Yeah.
But they were still like pretty niche, very elitist. Um, and that was it. There was no food media, like no food social media, I should say. It was the very infancy of social media, if at all. Like I still didn't really know about Facebook for several years.
Yeah.
And there was the Food Network in its infancy as well, but really there on the Food Network were some professional chefs, Emerald and Wolfgang, etc.
Right.
So that wasn't even in my purview at all. Food television
Yeah.
wasn't taken so seriously yet as a genre. Um, of course, there was Jacques Pepin's Julia Child, but that was PBS. That was also very niche. And that was it. So for me, being in food media was about writing and about the world around food writing in all its forms. And so that's what I
Yeah.
wanted to do. And that's what Jeffrey allowed me to learn about working for him at Vogue for 2 years. Um, and so what has changed? I mean, everything. Obviously, social media, the democratization of food in so many ways. Everybody has a voice. Everybody can be a critic, and everybody can be a cook at varying levels and degrees. And also the way that we all learned through travel. You don't necessarily need to leave your home anymore to travel around the world and see what people are cooking, eating, and doing in food all over the world. So that's a major change. And also the channels through which we get information about food. It is not just held captive by a few elite sources, not just the New
Yeah.
York Times and Gourmet Magazine dictate what we're eating and what restaurants we're going to. And now food television and and social media and the internet have created channels to give and receive information about food, obviously, that are just like exponential, and obviously have
Yeah.
given me a platform quite by accident. Well, I say by accident, but I earned my way. I didn't just like choose one day to be on television and declare myself an expert. I mean, going
Yeah.
on Top Chef happened, after 8 years of working in the food industry and ultimately ending up at Food and Wine Magazine, which that job, which I took, years after culinary school, when I went to work for Food and Wine, I worked for Jeffrey at Vogue, and then I went to work for a chef for Danielle Boulou for 3 years, not at all in media, but adjacent to media, because I was working for him at sort of this amazing turning point in the food world where the celebrity chef was being created. And I was working in
Yeah.
marketing and public relations for him. So I was behind the camera while he was in front of the camera. And I worked with him on all his special events. I helped him with 3 of his books. I opened restaurants with him. I went to the Today Show and Good Morning America with him when he was doing food segments. And I got to see those pieces of the media that you don't hear about. And then through him came to know the people at Food and Wine because he worked so closely with them on the media that he did, and went to work for them. And when I went to work for them, it was to work at the magazine for the magazine. I was actually directing part of the marketing department. I went on to be the event director. And it was only a side gig to me that I started doing television for them as sort of a voice and face of the magazine, mostly because no other editor wanted to do it. And because I had had this experience working behind the camera in PR for a chef, and I had all of my culinary degree and line cook experience, that I could put those things together, that I could talk and cook at the same time, which isn't something that most chefs or even food editors had to do. And it was just that kind of confluence of skills that I had gained, not necessarily knowing what they would add up to, that allowed me to then put it all together and go on television.
In terms of, all of these different roles that you were assuming, did you ever have that I can't do it or what am I doing type of
Oh yeah.
fear? Or,
Oh,
because it's like
you
were in rooms with very big personalities at a young age. It's like that's a lot, especially when you're dealing with a burgeoning media kind of empire that's starting to build or genre.
Sure.
what were those moments for you that still stick out that you're like, oof, I'm glad I got through that?
Oh, there's many, many, many. I mean, starting with my interview with Jeffrey. I mean, that interview was a 3-hour interview that I literally
Oh, wow.
thought I had bombed. There was no doubt in my mind. I walked out of that interview thinking, well, that was my New York moment. I can go back to Canada with my head held high, knowing that I bombed the interview, but I got 3 hours in a room with Jeffrey Steingarten while he grilled me on a million food subjects that I didn't know, completely humbled me and made me realize just how little I still have to know and how much I have to learn about the world of food. And wow, that was an amazing way to leave New York City, go out with a bang. And he called me a week later to say I was back in, I went home for that
Yeah.
Christmas vacation and to see my family. And he called me while I was home to say, well, get your butt back here because work starts tomorrow. And that's when I was like, oh, I need a visa. And I actually couldn't go back for about a month because he had to get me that visa, which he did, thankfully. And I went, but I started working for him from Canada. And that was a moment I still look back and cringe at that interview. And then so many moments afterwards when I went to work for Danielle Ballou, I remember my interview with him being like, I can't believe this guy is taking 20 minutes of his day to even talk to me. This kind of like titan in the food industry. And I think having them as mentors and the other people in Danielle's team who were my mentors, Georgette Farkas, who was the head of marketing for him for years and then left to do other things and is actually going back to work with him now again, which is remarkable. But, they taught me to be in a room with big people. It's just, doesn't mean you have to belittle yourself, but certainly it's humbling and it's mostly about keeping your mouth shut. So I learned how to do that really well, but now also I have more confidence to not be shut as much as I used to be. But I also that first day on Top Chef, I remember Food and Wine sort of sent me there, not at all knowing what we were going to be making. When they told me that they wanted me to do a reality cooking show, this was the very beginning of reality television, and the only thing I knew about reality television was like Survivor and Fear Factor. And I thought, well, this is the end for me. I'm going to be sent off as their guinea pig, and how am I going to explain to my mother that I'm on a reality show? I mean, there was not a lot of respect for reality shows yet, right? It was like a lot of, I think American Idol was around, so there were the judges there that were all sort of like, there was the Simons and the Paulas of those worlds, the really nice kind of sucker and the really mean judgy person. And so that was my context for what a judge should be. And also, like, I was worried that there would be this kind of fear factor element, that it would all be about gross out food and making things ridiculous. And I learned very quickly, and I think when I got on that set that first day, Tom and I looked at each other. We had known each other before, not well, but he and I had met a few times through the magazine and through my time with Jeffrey, actually. And we thought, well, this could be the death of both our careers. Because what if we're the laughing stock of our industries, and what if this isn't taken seriously, and what if we're making a huge mistake? And I mean, our heartbeats were pounding so loudly in that first episode that when we went to eliminate the very first chef that ever got eliminated on Top Chef, we had to redo it several times because the noise of our heartbeats, and specifically Katie Lee's, who was the host at the time, was interfering with the audio because we were all so nervous and really had no idea what we were doing, and we're really scared that this was a terrible mistake. But we learned quickly that we wanted to make a serious show about the real life of young cooks on the precipice of greatness, and thankfully Tom could lead us there as the kind of chef, the chef's chef that he was, and Bravo and the Magical Elves, who produced the show, listened and were open to making like a real show that spoke to the craft of cooking, and that was really cool.
When did you sort of have that moment where you realized it was lightning in a bottle, in terms of it's like you're going into your 21st season
Yeah.
now, it's like, when did you start saying like, wow, this is, and then starting to see all the other competition shows that obviously have popped
Yes, and there
over
were many,
the
and we see
the
ourselves
last
in
season.
all of them, but we don't think of it
Yeah.
as copycatting. It's like we're the let's say
Oh,
the godparents of a genre, not necessarily the grandparents. We're not that old yet. Um, I never thought, I still don't think we're lightning in a bottle. I don't think it ever was an overnight success and that it is a given that we get to make this show. That's the first thing.
yeah.
Every season is a bonus, especially, after our 20th anniversary. But certainly even, I tell the story all the time that I have a very clear memory of being in Chicago for season 4, and Andy Cohen, who was our executive producer and head of programming at Bravo, head of current programming, came to check up on us on set and took us out for dinner. I remember where we were. We were at Frontiera Grill in Chicago, um, Rick Bayless's amazing, iconic restaurant. And we sat down to dinner, all of us around the table. And I remember sitting next to Andy and saying, Andy, like, how long realistic? Because this is my first television show that I'd ever made, right? This is the only television experience I'd ever had, except for doing like 3-minute food segments on morning TV. And I said to Andy, like, how long could this possibly last? We're in season 4. I mean, I didn't think we'd get to season 2, right? So season 4, that's crazy. Like, what's the lifetime realistically of a show like this? And he looked at me and he was like, I don't know, season 11. And I laughed in his face. I thought he was ridiculous. I mean, he's Andy. He has way too much ambition for his own good, right? That's what I thought at the time. I'm like, he is way too positive. That is absurd. Season 11? How could we even? And here we are making season 21. I mean, we surpassed 11 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So we never took for granted, to my point, and we never thought that it was a given and a sure thing. But I will say there was a pivotal moment when I realized that there was something in the zeitgeist about what we were doing that had never been done before and that we were doing it right. It came at the end of season 2. There had been a lot of drama in season 2. We were still working out the reality of the show, and season 2 was by far our most dramatic season in the drama piece of it all. The cooks were good, but they were huge personalities, and that was still when the world of reality felt like it needed a villain and it needed scandal and it needed a lot of like what we call house reality, not necessarily what they were cooking, but what was going on in the house that they were all living in bunk beds, which does not happen anymore on our show. It was still a bit of the real world, left over. Yeah. And there was a lot of drama on that show, and there were moments when I thought that it was going to go really bad and that we would all be kind of taken down and that would be the end of it. And I was actually in Aspen for a meeting because at the time I was the director of the Food Wine Classic. And that was my real job. That was my full-time job still. And I was there for event meetings. And the finale of season 2 was about to air. And a lot of things had gone wrong. We got calls from the network about stuff that could come out and breach of contract possibly because the winner had been announced prematurely, and that was huge. And I thought I was going to lose my job at Food and Wine, and Food and Wine would lose the show, and the show would get canceled. I mean, we were up in arms about the whole thing. And I woke up really early the morning of the finale in my hotel room in Aspen, couldn't sleep. And back then, the show aired on Wednesday nights. Now it's on Thursdays. And Wednesday also happens to be the day that the dining section of the New York Times comes out. And I woke up early and I couldn't sleep. And I went to the door of my hotel room, and the New York Times was sitting, at my door. I had requested it. And I picked up the New York Times and flipped to the food section. And the front page of the food section, above the fold, was a giant picture of Top Chef and an article about Top Chef written by Frank Bruni, who was at the time the New York Times food critic.
Yeah.
And he wasn't at the time writing about much else except restaurants. And I almost vomited thinking, this is it. They're taking us down. Like, who knows what the content of this article will be? And instead, it was the most extraordinary article about how what we were doing was changing the conversation around food, around cooks and restaurants in America, and how this was the beginning of making food television the way food television should really be made, and crediting us and the show, and crediting the show and Bravo for kind of getting it right. And I remember like crying alone in my hotel room, thinking like this changes everything, and that way maybe I do still have a job, and it ended up going right. It all kind of went right
Yeah.
from there. And I do remember thinking at that moment that this is like a pivotal moment for the show and for my career and the possibilities of what it could mean for the future.
That's amazing. And, when you look back on all of the seasons, what have been your biggest learnings, whether it be from, judging to producing? It's like you've taken on many roles over the years. What does
Yeah.
that really look like for you?
Wow. A lot. You know, 20 seasons of a show. It's been 18 years, but 20 seasons
Yeah.
is not, as I said, a given. And the fact that we are able to still be making the show, we joke. My husband makes fun of us that, like, every year, quite by total extraordinary luck and hard work, a combination, we've been nominated for Emmys, and we show up at the Emmys, and over 15 years of going to the Emmys, we have seen the greatest shows in the golden age of television come and go, and we're still like hanging around on that red carpet, and no one really knows how. um, we've seen like The Sopranos and Sex and the City and Game of Thrones and Mad Men and Breaking Bad and Lost and Friday Night Lights, like all these iconic television shows that are the shows that I think of as the greatest shows made, that all came and went because they were scripted, right? And they had an arc that had to
Yeah.
end at some point. And then there's obviously a few other reality shows that have been on as long as us, but very few. And that's an incredible learning for me, because I think what it says is that our show is, yes, about food, but it's really about people. It's really about the characters. And I use that term broadly because I think it is about the life story of these extraordinary young chefs. And that's been the highlight of being on the show, is meeting and helping to, I use the word mentor, but I don't, it's, to guide and shape a little bit of the beginnings of what has gone on to be like the greatest forces in the food world for good. Our show
Yeah.
has had, and I say this with like quite literally, like a profound impact on the economy of restaurants in America at this point, 18 years later, because hundreds of chefs have come out of our show and gone on to be some of the biggest names in food media and in restaurants. But they're also doing such good work, you know what I mean? For causes of diversity and inclusion and gender identity and politics and sustainability and climate and introducing immigrant pathways and cultures and food ways into the world that were under appreciated and mostly unknown. Like, and this has nothing to do with us. They did that stuff.
Yeah.
But to be at the beginning of watching those journeys and helping them along has been like the greatest privilege and learning of my own life. I'm being a bit grandiose, but it's true.
But you're allowed to be.
It's
You're allowed to
amazing,
be.
and I'm not taking like credit for it. Like, I look at
Yeah.
them, and so countless. I mean, I can list off the names of chefs who are now household names in the world, and I'm so proud to have known them at a point in their career when they were just getting started. So that's a huge learning. The other learning, which is like, basic in a way, is that like there's always more to eat. There's always more to learn. And just because I'm an expert at what I do doesn't mean that I'm done learning, right? And that's the most beautiful thing I think about food as a genre in media, is that there's like always a new place to visit, a new ingredient to discover, a new dish to try, a new combination of things to talk about and to get excited about. So my job is like never ending. So there's always more learning to do, and that's really cool. No 2 days are alike, and every season, people say like, how do you keep it fresh? Well, we go to a different city in a different location, different part of the world, and that introduces us to 1,000 new things, big and small, about that place. And so that's it, like lights a fire every time, and that's really great, figurative and literal
Yeah.
fire. And also, the story of our show, the story of the evolution of what we've done and how we've changed it over the years, and how I think what we do on our show is a direct reflection of the changes that have happened in our industry over those same 2 decades. Right? There's been profound change, for better or worse. There's been really dark times. The entertainment industry and the restaurant industry have had reckonings that were long overdue and are still being dealt with.
Yeah.
And so we've really tried to reflect and make a show that is an honest representation of all of those points. We talk about them, we're transparent about them, and we push ourselves and our show to do better, which I think in turn forces the industry to do better. But I also think the same is true in the other direction. I think the industry pushes us, and it becomes this very sort of give and take relationship that we are able to then show the rest of the world.
As you've kind of found your way within the industry, what's kind of on the horizon for you in terms of, obviously Top Chef, you've written books, you have cookbooks, you've done judging on other shows, obviously writing, you've been in the magazine world, is there something you're looking at in 5, 10? I know you don't like 5-year plans.
Yes, though. Yeah. I mean, I get the question. I'm not going to say 5 or 10, but I'm just working towards, sure, both in the immediate future and on the long term. I think that, and specifically, I talked a little about this when I did the panel for women in entertainment. We are still largely underrepresented in all parts of and jobs in and around food and in and around entertainment. The biggest sort of evolution for me is to know that I want to have more control over the content that I put out into the world. And so that I can control my own schedule, my life as a parent, my life as I get older, and the things I'm interested in. And I want to tell different stories. And how to do that is really to be behind the camera and to produce in a more vocal way and in a more direct, purposeful way. So in 2014, I founded Bumble Pie Productions with a partner, and Bumble Pie, it was really founded with the specific goal of creating more pathways in food media for women and people who identify as women or as female, and wanting to tell deeper stories by women. And we're still working to do that. But we have two big, hopefully three, but two big projects right now in development that I'm really excited about. Mostly because coming out of the pandemic, where we lay low and sort of focused on other things for a while, I'm feeling like we're at a very difficult moment in the world of entertainment.
Yeah.
In terms of buying and obviously the strikes and the pandemic and the way that I think we all consume content. But I'm really excited about hopefully these two projects being out in the world, both in the scripted and non-scripted world, which is new for me. So that's what I'm focusing on right now. And fantastic. So those are exciting. And I think just more like that, more ways to tell stories that resonate with me, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm always the one in front of the camera speaking. Yeah. Again, keeping my mouth shut, but in a different way, working in a different capacity. So that's sort of what the goal is now. And also just cracking the code on what I think everyone doesn't really know what's to come in the world of entertainment. entertainment, right?
Yeah.
Television, streaming, film, content online is so ever changing and shifting so quickly. So just trying to make shows that I can be proud of and that I feel contribute to the good of humanity and taste delicious too is something I try to do every day.
That's I think those are amazing ambitions, and we can't wait to see what you come up with in the next. We're fingers crossed for you.
Yes.
Across the board. Last couple questions because I know we're wrapping
Okay.
up. What is your go-to comfort food?
Oh,
Like what is a good
yeah.
what is a good dish to you, and what is your comfort food?
Sure. I was just talking about this with someone else, so it's top of mind. But like we eat a lot of matzo ball soup in my house. I deeply believe in the healing power of matzo ball soup for your physical and mental health. Um, I really find solace in dark chocolate. Um, I think the act of cooking is so comforting to me. It is my like
Yeah.
happy place, my place to work stuff out, to 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 unwind and to also use my brain in a different way than it gets used in so many other facets of my life. And so cooking is comforting, and my favorite things to cook, I think, are things that cook slowly and deliberately. So winter is a good time for comfort food for me because I get to do a lot of braising and I get to make a lot of soup. I think,
Yeah.
soup in its simplest form is like a metaphor for so many things, right? Building soup,
It's like
building flavor, learning to cook, the basics of cooking, but also it is something you make to sustain yourself. It can be super simple and humble, but it has great power to and nutrients in it. So I make a lot of soup, especially when I'm stressed out.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, Gail, I thank you so much for coming on today. We really appreciate it. Onward and upward. We are so excited
Thank
for the
you.
21st season
Thank
of
you.
Top
Thank you.
Chef.
So am I. It was a real coming out of London and our 20th anniversary, season 21 in Wisconsin, which, is definitely a different place, a different and a different. We really wanted to make a lot of changes and build on all the learnings that we were able to gather from our 20th season. And I think it will feel like a new dawn in a way, a new era in many ways, not just in ones that seem obvious. So I think I'm excited for how the show will look and feel this season too. And I get to take on a bigger role in some ways, which felt great.
That's amazing.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe and leave a review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. To stay up to date with In Her Words, join the conversation by following Women in Entertainment on our social channels and subscribe to our weekly newsletter at womeninentertainment.com.